Hey, and what's up, Long Beach? I'm your host, Julia Goldman, and you're tuning into Season 4, Episode 7 of Artist Banter, a daily 49er original podcast that delves into the many manifestations of artistry within our local scene. Today, I am joined virtually with Kaitlyn Smith to explore the purpose and application of artificial intelligence in art. Smith is an artist, photographer, and as she describes, a maker of things. And she uses AI as a tool within her artistry. Kaitlyn, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, could you introduce yourself and give kind of like an overview of what you do?
My name's Kaitlyn Smith. I'm an artist and educator currently living in Tucson, Arizona, but I'm from rural Ohio. So I grew up in the Rust Belt, which sort of influences my practice in a lot of ways. I'm really interested in the ways that automation specifically has affected working class Americans really across the country. It began in the Rust Belt, but has sort of branched out from there as I've moved away from that space. But I'm really interested in sort of the ethical and moral implications of AI. And really, this is something that has sort of blown up like in 6 months, right? In the last 6 months, these sort of conversations have become more and more everyday and commonplace. And so I think, my interests in AI started out as this is a way to talk about the things I'm interested in, but now it's something everyone's interested in too.
Huh. A bit over a month ago, I went to the UCR Arts AI Post Photography Gallery. That was titled Every Day We Have to Invent the Reality of This World. It was there that I ran into Kaitlyn's piece, Lights Out, and I was just absolutely entranced by it. Lining a TV screen was a rotating collection of human faces, which depict the American working class. And Kaitlyn did this by gathering 50,000 photos of factory workers from Facebook and then training an artificial intelligence model to examine and analyze them. From there, what's displayed in Lights Out is the machine's interpretation of the labor force, and 60,000 rotating deepfakes that move up and down the screen like a conveyor belt. So here's a little snippet of that work. So, Caitlin, could I hear about what the process was to create Lights Out was like and the intention behind that piece?
Yes. Looking back at it now, it is insane how much work that video was. And I don't mean that, I don't think I really did more work than I needed to at that time. But again, these like text to image generators are so commonplace. Like I just found out Canva, like the graphic design app has one, right? Like they're everywhere. And so, I feel like that project I made 4 years ago. And looking back now, I feel like I could have made it, if I was to remake it today, it would take me probably a fourth of the period of that time. So it's important, I think, to
Huh.
put ourselves in 2020 when I'm making this piece and understanding that, like, I had to work with a computer engineer to help me write this script to create my own data set and program the system, right? That just didn't exist 4 years ago. So today I could just ask, Dolly or whatever mid journey that you're using to give me factory workers and it just would, but that didn't
Mhm.
exist then. And so really the process of it began with trying to find a big enough data set. I had to collect, honestly, I probably could have kept going, but 50,000 seemed like a pretty high goal to reach anyway. And, I started just by Googling, but it became obvious really quickly I wasn't going to reach that number. And so I went to Facebook, which I love. I think I might be the only millennial that actually really loves Facebook. As an inspiration source, I use it a lot as an archive, as a source of inspiration. I think it's really interesting in terms of social media. Um, But my dad's a factory worker, and so I started with his profile picture, and then I clicked on his friends. And the interesting thing is people will like check into work. So then I would find a different plant, and then I would click on that and all of the workers that I'd like reported or checked in on Facebook. And so it actually was not difficult to do. It was fairly easy to do. It was just incredibly time consuming. So I mean, I probably spent 9 months just on Facebook 8 hours a day, which I don't think is an exaggeration. I started dreaming in Facebook. Like my brain, I think, has finally
Aw.
sort of reprogrammed itself. But that was really the, step one. And then step two was sort of the painstaking putting them all into columns. So I put all of those images into columns and then animated them all separately. And again, I did it probably in sort of a really backwards way that if I was to redo it, there are definitely technologies that would make it easier. But it was really rudimentary. I'm not an animator, so I was just doing the best I could. I took those big rows into Photoshop and I just screen recorded myself scrolling them, right? So like each one
Hmm.
I actually animated. I recorded it scrolling across the screen. Again, there's someone listening to this like screaming that there's a way easier way to do it. But it was a labor of love, right? It was this really sort of monotonous, repetitive action to actually create the piece itself.
I think that also speaks towards like the meaning of the piece because it's so heavily like to have the intention behind it and you're so intentionally involved within every single step that you also get to examine it like the same way the AI was. I think like going further, there's like this really large debate and fear of AI within its use in media and artistry. And my question for you, to use AI as a tool to kind of like comment on the workforce and interpret the workforce, why did you make the choice to use AI in the first place?
When I went to this was my graduate thesis work, this project. And when I went to grad school, I went to the University of Arizona. I started in 2017 and I got into grad school doing like alt process darkroom photography. Like that's the kind of work I was making. I really love working with my hands. But I don't know, I consider myself an artist first. Like the idea comes and then whatever the correct medium is or approach, that's what I'll do. And so, I was really interested in these ideas of sort of the changing socioeconomic status of the working class and middle America as a whole. And it became really obvious that, a lot of what was going on was different issues in both, in job loss has a lot to do with automation and it's not necessarily job loss, but it's that jobs are changing and the education and skill sets that people have don't really match the jobs that exist today. And it
Mm.
makes sense to be making like cyanotypes on glass and talking about automation, right? And so, I would never have, like, even 5, 10 years ago, if you would have asked me, shown me the work I was making now and been like, guess who made this? I wouldn't have believed it was me because I never would have considered myself a digital artist, but the work needed to be. And so really it was a huge learning curve to be like, okay, you're talking about automation. And the idea occurred to me, well, how interesting would it be to sort of ask the machine to create its own workforce, its own employees, to use the employees that have lost their jobs to train a model to create what it thinks a factory worker is, what it thinks a blue collar worker looks like. And so again, it was the idea that came first. And then I was like, okay, now I have to figure out how to implement these technologies to comment on them, right? I think it's really powerful when you're able to connect the process and the medium back to the concept.
Was that like the first and the beginning, I guess, shift of utilizing AI as a tool in your art?
Yes. And again, I mean, really putting yourself back into 2020, that didn't really like exist commercially in the way it does now. And
Yeah.
even I was having a conversation with someone at this show. I was at the opening that you saw my work at, and I thought my piece looked the most, and I'm not saying this in a bad way, I thought it looked the most dated of all the work there, which is a crazy thing to say about a piece that I made 4 years ago, right? That's nothing
Uh-huh.
terms of the canon of art and art history. But that's just how quickly this technology is changing. And so, in 4 years, the aesthetic of that digital aesthetic has changed so much to what we're seeing now is like this hyper photorealistic applications of AI. And so that's interesting. I think it will be sort of a fascinating for some art history major, 15, 20 years from now to put together this history of the development of AI. But I think that video piece, yeah, it really falls at the beginning of that. And of course, there are people that were working with these sort of AI emerging technologies before then. But it's similar to photography. In the beginning of photography, you had to have a scientific background to do the process, right? Now,
Mhm.
any picture, now anyone can get on a text to image generator and make a piece with an algorithm, right? And so it's just a lot more accessible than it was. So the way I'm working with AI has sort of developed alongside that as well.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned that, like, you, thought your piece looked dated because, like, my perception from looking at everything was that what I liked about the entire gallery was that, it showed, like, I guess, the flaws within the current AI, art models too. Like, it showed, there were pictures in the gallery where people had, like, misstrewn, like, fingers and limbs, and I think too that, like, speaks for how the future of AI will, like, continue to improve, you know?
I think that's
Um
interesting too. I'm interested in sort of the language of the medium, and I think part of why I always liked experimental darkroom processes is this level of chance. And I think AI, it might seem like this super technological advanced thing, and it is. I mean, it is, but it doesn't experience reality the same way we do. It's not a camera, it's not, oil paint, right? It's different. And so to me, I think there's something really beautiful in those sorts of mistakes. And
Mhm.
I think that's indicative of the medium. And I kind of love the moment it's at now. I don't necessarily look forward to it being so hyper photorealistic that we can't tell it apart from other mediums.
Huh, yeah, to kind of pick your brain more about that, um, what is your current stance on the use of AI in art? And maybe, like, I think before, how has it changed?
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. I think people freak out and they see it and they immediately want to say, like, this isn't art. And you get a lot of like, that's too easy to be art. But people said that about Pollock too. People always, you're in a museum, you hear someone say, my 3-year-old could have made that, and the thing is, it's like, yeah, well, they didn't though. But I think it's sort of people, think it's easy, so it can't be art, or they write it off. And I think for me, it's all about the concept, right? I think that a lot of AI art is made just because it's fun and it's easy and it's cutting edge and it's a novelty. And I think you can tell. I think those pieces don't stand up. But when I see artists who are really thinking creatively in their use of AI and they're thinking of it more as a collaborator as opposed to what's making the work, that's interesting. I also think it takes, a skill set to be able to write generative text in a way that produces the imagery that you want, right? It's a whole different way of thinking about work. It really requires you to have a strong understanding of art terminology and different phrases to get to really highly specific things. And I think where AI really interests me is seeing applications of it where, I ask my students a lot, I teach photography, how do you photograph something that's already happened or that you don't have access to, right? Like, this is a question as photographers we ask a lot. And I think when we can come up with creative solutions to those questions, that's when we make really fascinating pictures. And I think AI
Mhm.
answers that in a really interesting way. It allows us to sort of tell histories or narratives that have often been overlooked in our sort of like whitewashed patriarchal society. It allows different voices to come forward. It allows different narratives and stories to be told. And I think when I see artists using AI in those sorts of really thoughtful ways, because they want to talk about things that they don't have access to or can't photograph or already happened, that's when it becomes interesting to me.
Thank you. Do you think, like, on the opposing side, like the fear of AI, do you think that there are any valid criticisms within it?
Yes. Yes, I do. I feel like every photo conference I've been to in the last, like, again, 9 months have really been about this. And I think there's a lot of valid concerns. I think, from a non-artistic perspective, and this is something I'm really interested in my work is jobs and, how we make a living and make a meaning and how we spend our time and sort of how we found value in the world. And there is a big concern in terms of like commercial photography specifically, that AI is going to take away those jobs. And we're already seeing it happening in things like photo retouching, right? I graduated undergrad in 2016, not that long ago. And that was like the first job almost everyone I graduated with had was they went and they worked as like a photo retoucher for think like Abercrombie was based out of the town I went to undergrad in, but that doesn't really
Mhm.
exist in the same way anymore because two clicks of a button and it's retouched, right, with AI. So that is an honest concern. Um, but I think AI is to photography what photography was to painting, right? Cameras were invented and people were like, painting is dead. And that's not true. It just freed painters to not have to make like hyper realistic paintings anymore. That's why we got
Mhm.
the Impressionists and abstract expressionism and all these really interesting movements. And so I think, it's kind of we're in an interesting place for photography where it's like, okay, AI art is allowing photographers to sort of break out of what they've traditionally been doing. And so maybe it is a really exciting moment for photography. Again, people still make paintings. So I think there are genuine concerns. I mean, I think AI and artificial intelligence is scary in a lot of ways, but I do think we have to remember that, you know, AI can only do what it's programmed to do by humans, at least now. I mean, I don't know. Maybe 10 years from now, this is a different conversation. But when we think of
Mhm.
like generative imagery, especially, it can only make work from the data sets it's trained with. And we see a lot of biases in that as well. There's a lot of things that you maybe are trying to get the algorithm to make, but it just can't, specifically with like minority groups, right? They don't exist as much within the algorithm. But,
Yeah.
you know, it is a human invention. It follows human parameters. And I guess humans are kind of terrifying, so maybe that's something to be scared by. But overall, I don't think it needs to be this like terrifying thing. It's happening, right? It makes sense to be educated.
Mhm. Sort of like looking towards the future as well, of like the revolutionized tech, the conversations about regulating that tech. What do you think like is in store for the future of the field of AI art?
Oh man, in terms of like regulation and things, I think so much of technology just changes so much more quickly than it can be regulated. But I think the thing I'm excited about with I love appropriation art. I think it's this very divisive thing. You either like love it or you hate it. Like I think Duchamp's fountain is brilliant. I love that kind of stuff.
I'm
I'm
sorry,
sorry.
what is appropriation art?
So appropriation art. So this idea of taking someone else's work or a pre-existing image or idea, whatever it might be, and then turning it into your own, whether that is something that it looks different in the end, or there are oftentimes cases, Sherry Levine's a great example of this. She just rephotographed Walker Evans' photographs and called them her own, right? The
Mhm.
final image doesn't change, but the idea behind it does. And we see this start with Dada in the 30s and the ready-made, and then we see it transition. And I
Mhm.
think AI art is really sort of this like advanced form of appropriation because it's being trained with art made by different people. So I don't think that it's really anything super new in terms of that. I just think the styles with which we appropriate other artists' work change as technologies change. I think where the issue lies, and I think a lot of people, struggle with this, and I think for fair reasons, when we're using artists' work to train the data sets, right? So there's a lot of artists that are really upset that they're not being credited if they're being trained in data sets, and I get that, right? I think like anything these data sets are so big it's hard to know whether or not your work's being pulled. I think the same thing a lot where I'm like, how many photographs do I exist in the background of because I just walked through someone Snapchatting something, so it's like
Mhm.
hard. I think it's a similar conversation in terms of consent and permission and all of these things, but at the end of the day I think it's just this like really sort of big version of appropriation, of borrowing and remixing, right? It's like similar to like remixing in hip hop. That's appropriation, but musically. And so, it's something that people have done forever. I just think it's getting done at a way bigger scale because these data sets are so large. However, for me
Mhm.
personally, as someone who loves appropriation art, I'm really excited by that. I think that there's a lot of opportunity, again, not just to add to the visual noise, but to sort of reinterpret what already exists and giving it new meaning.
If that's the state of the if that's what, like what the future is looking like, what do you think the general public and artists should be aware of for the future?
I mean, now I'm going to get all conspiratorial and be like, we're in the surveillance state, right? I think it's just kind of this contract that we enter into just by being born in as 21st century American citizens, right? Or really anyone in these sort of like technologically advanced societies where it's like, you're constantly being watched, you're constantly being photographed. I mean, we're doing this on a webcam. We like know that the government can watch us. Like we know that, right? But we still have our webcams. We still use these technologies. And so it's this conversation about what sort of privacy rights we're willing to give up for freedom, for access, for creative expression. I don't know. I don't. I think it's just good to maybe not be scared of new technology because I think it can be overwhelming. I think it's really easy to just be like, I'm not thinking about it, but rather just try to stay informed and maybe open-minded. Um, Instead of just writing things off or not thinking about them. But it's tricky. So I don't know. I think it's a really big conversation. I'm not really sure how I feel about it in a lot of regards. Like I use these technologies in my art practice, but also they are morally questionable in a lot of ways.
I agree. I think staying informed is important. What about you personally though? Like what do you see your future relationship with the medium of AI art being?
Yeah. Again, I never wanted to be an AI artist or like a digital really artist in any way. And so, but I continue to see myself being interested in these themes of sort of the working class and their relationship kind of to the world of fine art. Like I really, I think it's important. It's a very underrepresented group of people in a lot of ways, in terms of white collar spaces and fine art spaces. And these are the stories I'm interested in telling because this is where I'm from. These are the people who raised me, and I have a lot of respect for blue collar workers in this sort of way of life. And that way of life is changing rapidly because of these technologies. And so I find myself sort of pushing and pulling between using the sort of the archives at my fingertips to create work. I'm also an incredibly introverted person. I would never be a street photographer. I'm not a portrait photographer, right? But I like talking about these things. I'm doing a project now about the trucking industry, which I don't really want to go into too much detail because I have a big show opening in October, so it's a little bit under wraps. But
Hmm.
I wanted to be able to photograph semi trucks in all 50 states. That was not going to happen in the amount of time I had. So that's why I turned to Google Street View because it's allowed me from the comfort of my own home to travel to all of these places. And so, yeah, I think as the ideas evolve, the concepts evolve, these industries evolve, my work will evolve too. But I'm not necessarily married to AI. Like I don't need to use AI in every piece I make. But if it makes
Hmm.
sense to, if it lends itself to the idea, the concept, then absolutely, I'll keep playing. Also, it's fun. Like I do just enjoy sometimes going into like Adobe Firefly and typing the craziest phrase I can think of and just seeing what it makes. It's kind of interesting to attempt to understand how the machine is thinking or interpreting reality. So it'll always be there, but
Yeah.
maybe not at the forefront.
Thank you so much. Caitlin, thank you so much for coming on today and having this conversation with me.
It was really good to meet you. Like I said, I'm so happy you saw the work and you reached out. It's very fun to know that people are actually seeing the things that you're making and that you're passionate about.
Yeah, I really have been wanting to take on a project like this for a while because like artificial intelligence, the industry of tech, and the media opinions surrounding the topic is something that's like really always fascinated me, and I'm just really incredibly thankful to have the chance to like explore these conversations and hear about your experience in it.
Thank you for having me.
For that project that you were talking about with Google Street View and then the show that's coming up, is there a place that you'd like to send everyone if they wanted to go and follow along?
Yeah, so you can find all of my previous work on my website, which is just my name, KaitlynJoSmith.com. But sort of updates and day-to-day happenings all get posted on my Instagram. I try to be fairly regular without being sucked into the addictive cycles of social media. But you can just find me at Kaitlyn Jo Smith too, and I'll be posting updates, and as that show gets closer, announcements for it. But it's in Boston, so it's the opposite side of the country. I have to ship everything
Mhm.
out there, but I'm really looking forward to it.
And thank you so much for tuning into this week of Artist Banter. If you want to hear more from Long Beach's own contributors of art and music, check out our website, daily49er.com, and our socials at daily49er. We appreciate you being here. Take care and see you soon.